transmission. Jonas Salk, the nature of the virus that caused polio, etc. They lived in societies where they were free to do so. But in an authoritarian state, whether religious or secular, the free-thinking mind is stifled. Any dictator, including the medieval church, the Taliban, Hitler, Stalin, et al., demands unquestioning obedience, which they may receive from hordes of unthinking followers. But the independent mind, capable of bringing intellectual advances undreamed of by his fellow man, will not bow or scrape before authority. His allegiance is to his unique vision, his original insight, his solitary grasp of revolutionary truths. The creative mind, capable of splitting the atom or inventing the electric lighting system, is capable of challenging the moral rectitude of a dictator's regime. Great intellects do not limit their thinking to physics, electrical engineering, or art. They do not turn off the mind with the laboratory or studio lights. They think and speak out regarding important issues of personal morality and governmental policy. They understand and often denounce the evils of the oppressive regimes under which they exist. Such a pioneering mind is a dictator's primordial foe, the one deadly enemy of any statist regime. And the men of brute force know it. Leonid Brezhnev, for example, sentenced Nobel Prize-winning physicist Andrei Sakharov to internal exile in Siberia for denouncing the 1979 Soviet invasion of Afghanistan. And at that, Sakharov was lucky that Stalin wasn't in power, because it would have been internal exile under Stalin. Mao Zedong turned loose the juvenile thugs of the Red Guards to brutalize and murder many of China's leading teachers, artists, and intellectuals during the so-called Cultural Revolution of the late 1960s. Some of the victims were even eaten. Pol Pot and the Khmer Rouge summarily executed all educated Cambodians and burned books during their 4-year reign of terror between 1975 and 1979. In Cambodia, it was enough to have gone to secondary school, or sometimes even simply to know how to read in order to be classified as intellectual and consequently to be executed. As a fourth example, in the antebellum South, the slave drivers refused to allow any black individual to get an education. Even free blacks weren't allowed to attend school at their own expense. For a black to try to get educated or for some white person to try and help him was a serious offense. In all of these instances, and hundreds more, the dictators and slave drivers knew that the educated men were the most likely to identify and criticize the regime's iniquities, thereby potentially riling the people against them. To borrow a boxing analogy here, kill the head, the slave drivers know, the dictators know, and the body follows. Under statism, in any of its forms, the men of the mind are suppressed, exiled, and or murdered. The higher the degree of statism, of government control over its citizens, the more intense the suppression. The collectivist dictatorships, the National Socialists and the Communists, were the worst. These were totalitarian states, imposing total, not partial control over the life of the individual. Under these murderous regimes, which, by the way, state-of-the-art accounting has responsible for 125 million murders. 25 million by the Nazis, not to be outdone, 100 million by the communists. Under these murderous regimes, millions, tens of millions, hundreds of millions of innocent men and women were butchered, including God knows how many writers, teachers, scientists, artists, and entrepreneurs. The mind was utterly suppressed. All thought and intellectual work were dictated by the state. Communism, the most brutally oppressive form of thought control in man's history, is the best example of Ayn Rand's principle. Every communist country, without exception, the Soviet Union, China, North Korea, Vietnam, Cambodia, Cuba, were as abysmally poor as they were savagely repressed. Since the mind is the source of all human progress, economic as well as in other areas, the greater the freedom the mind has, the more widespread the advance it brings. Conversely, the worse the governmental suppression, the less progress the mind can achieve. If the Marxists were correct, and manual labor, not the mind, but manual labor, were the fundamental source of economic prosperity, then totalitarianism could create wealth. For if men were just physical laborers, like so many barnyard animals, then the brute force the communists impose could compel men to produce, just as oxen or horses are whipped to motivate them to greater effort. But Marx was wrong fundamentally, not merely in advocating socialism and opposing capitalism, but deeper, in his repudiation of the mind for materialism and brute physical labor. Ayn Rand explains the observational evidence provided so abundantly by reality. Capitalism, not statism in any form, produces abundance because the mind is the fundamental source of the values upon which human life depends, and the mind's creative work requires freedom. Another philosophical point here that Ayn Rand establishes, and that is the moral point here. It's the acceptance of an individual's inalienable right to his own life and the pursuit of his own happiness that is so integral also to the success of the capitalist system. Capitalism is based on the moral code of egoism. Capitalism recognizes the individual's need to create values his life depends on and his inalienable right to do so. Individuals are consequently unleashed to pursue their own interest and success under capitalism, to seek an education, to work hard, to earn and to own property, to develop new ideas or products, to invent, to start entrepreneurial firms, to bring their new products to market, to convince the customers that the new methods or products are superior to the old, to seek profit, to make a fortune, etc. Under statism, by contrast, individuals have no right to their own lives. Rather, they're subservient to the group, the race, the working class, or the state. Altruism, the code of self-sacrifice to others, not egoism, is the dominant moral theory. The individual has no right to pursue his own success and happiness, and entrepreneurship is stifled. His life belongs to the state. The most talented and ambitious people then seek to flee to freer countries. The so-called brain drain occurs. And at home, of course, the brain is suppressed. Individuals have no right to their lives and consequently no right to their own minds. They have no right to their property, which of course is brutally confiscated, no right to seek profit, and ultimately, of course, they're simply enslaved by the state. It is the egoistic moral code of capitalism that frees individuals to own property and to create wealth in pursuit of their own profit. Only when the moral principle, this is, I think, an important point in Ayn Rand's writings also, that is only when the moral principle of an individual's inalienable right to his own life is recognized, that is, only when egoism is embraced and self-sacrifice rejected, does the practical consequence of enormous and widespread prosperity follow. By recognizing an individual's need and inalienable right to create the values his life depends on, capitalism puts the profit motive in service of value creation, thereby liberating the most productive men to grow food, create skyscrapers, discover cures for diseases, etc. That's what's responsible for the enormous wealth of the capitalist nations. So I think what we see here is several points. First of all, just to summarize here, one, we talk why is freedom, the free countries, without exception, the free countries wealthy and the unfree countries poor? I think you see because one, the mind, not manual labor, not faith, but the rational thinking mind is the source of all advance. Two, the mind requires political economic freedom, and contained within that is the third part, the egoistic part, that individuals have a right to their own life, and then in pursuit of the pursuit of the values their lives require, of course, create the wealth that we see under freedom. One final question to be discussed tonight. What can the United States and the other free countries do to export capitalism more broadly and fully? Given that global capitalism will bring freedom and vastly increase prosperity to the repressed and starving nations of the third world, what can we in the free world do to promote that process? There are at least three things that every one of us can do to help spread freedom and prosperity around the globe. One, understand the principle and support the policy of international free trade. Free trade simply means that individuals and companies in one country can trade with individuals and companies in other countries without barriers and taxes imposed by the respective governments involved. Morally, it is the right of every individual to engage in voluntary trade with any other individual he chooses, so long as we're not talking about criminals and terrorists. So long as men do not engage in criminal acts, i.e., as long as they do not initiate force or fraud against others, governments must respect and protect their right of